Coming up today on Uncommon Sense, join us as we interview one of our favorite guests, Joseph Pearce, the acclaimed author and speaker. You probably have seen him at a conference, and you can see him at another conference coming up soon. Hello, and welcome to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I'm Grettelyn Darkey, your co-host, and I'm joined by Joe Grabowski, my fellow co-host. How are you, Joe?
Very well, Grettelyn. Thank you.
Great. And we are so happy to be joined once again by Joseph Pearce. How are you today, Joseph?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's good to be back on.
It's great to have you, as always. So we are so excited to talk to you. But first, before we get into the conference, your talk there, all that good stuff, what are you up to these days? What can our listeners look forward to from you?
Well, so I try to keep every morning free for writing, but I've become a bit like G.K. Chesterton. I've become a bit of a jolly journalist because one makes more money from writing for journals than for writing books, unfortunately. But I'm hoping to get back to writing books at some point. But I don't have a salaried position. I'm quite happy about that. But it does mean, of course, that I have to chase the buck a bit. So, I write for about 5 or 6 different journals. So four mornings a week I try to set aside for writing, and it's normally journalism. And then in the afternoon I do everything else, which is teaching online, speaking online, a little bit of traveling, not quite as much as I used to be, and I hope that remains the same because I like that too. Editing the St. Austin reviews, doing editing work also for Ignatius Press, appearing weekly on the Off the Shelf, the Ignatius Press's book club. So keeping myself very busy and remaining very happy.
Wonderful. Well, where can our listeners and viewers find your work? Which journals, and is there a central website they can go to?
Yeah, the best one-stop place for me is my personal website, because everything I write for journals such as Crisis or the Imaginative Conservative or Catholic World Report, etc., National Catholic Register, anything I write, I post a link to my personal website, and same thing with links to podcasts such as this one. Anybody sends me a link to anything I've done, I post it to jpearce.co, so jpearce.co, my personal website. And if you go to the blog section of that, you'll basically see everything I'm doing almost as soon as I'm doing it.
Wonderful. And we will have that posted in the show notes down below, so make sure that you check there. Wonderful. Anything else exciting happening for you before the conference?
Well, I'm sort of wishing wistfully that I never see the inside of an airport ever again. That's not going to happen, not least because I'm flying to Louisiana to spend time with you folks. But I am flying at the end of April to Australia, and it's the first time I've ever been to Australia. And I'm doing a mini speaking tour there in three of the three major cities in Australia: Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne. Following the illustrious Dale Chris, no less, who blazed a trail for me a few months back. Hopefully, he didn't sully the atmosphere. Though hopefully, I'm going to bask in his reflected glory. But I'm going back there in a few weeks. Going there in a few weeks for the first time ever. So it's good to tread virgin territory, and so I'm looking forward to going down under. So that would be good. So that's the big travel news coming up. Other than that, I'm doing what I basically always do.
Wonderful. Well, Joe, do you want to take over and ask about the talk a little bit? It's an interesting one this year, huh?
It is, absolutely, yeah. And I think this is going to be one of the highlights of the summer conference for me, because we kind of have a unique thing going on, whereby you and Christopher Check are going to do kind of a tag team double act back to back of talks on something a lot of people probably may not be familiar with. So it's going to be covering the work, epic poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Evangeline, and then also the true history behind that poem, in which I don't know, Joseph. I think the British are kind of the bad guys there, but maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what you'll be speaking on and why this poem is important, and even just maybe the place of Longfellow, because alas, I don't think as many people read him as once did.
Yeah, so there's about 3 questions there. So thanks for bombarding me with 3 questions at once there, Joe. I will do my best to fill them. Yeah, so as regards, first of all, the British having something to do with it, absolutely. But that I'm not British, I'm English. Let me answer your question here with 6 lines of my own poetry called Sunset, which will basically which will clear me and the true Englishman from any stain of what happened to the Acadians. So when Britain had an empire, the sun would never set, but the sun set over England, and Englishmen forget that greater than the empire are the rolling Yorkshire moors, and more glorious the dales than all the empire's wars.
Mhm.
Mm.
So to hell with the empire, and I'm on the side of the Canadians as a good true Englishman, and so was Longfellow with this wonderful poem based upon legends, should we say? And one of the enigmatic things about the poem is the character of what he'd be probably Evangeline in French. We have a daughter I call Evangeline. She calls herself Evangeline, and Longfellow calls the same name Evangeline because it seems to be what the rhyme he's working towards there. So it's an anglicisation of the French name. But she's a very enigmatic character, and to me, she's one of the great heroines of literature. Alongside Penelope from the Odyssey and Beatrice from the Divine Comedy. She's a marvelous model of idealized femininity and fortitude.
Mm.
And the so in on background, the again, I think maybe a lot of our listeners, and we don't want to steal too much of Chris Jack's thunder here, but I think that's doubtful because Chris will probably have very fine details about what caliber bullets were being used and everything else. So so I don't think we run too much risk of that. But the story of the Acadians and why it relates to where we're headed this year, maybe say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically, the 2 minute version of the tragedy is that obviously there was tension in the northeastern part of the American colonies because this is before American independence, and we need to also understand it wasn't just the British; it was the very anti-Catholic New Englanders that were also very much involved in this. The tensions between the French-speaking, the people in what is now Canada and the upper reaches of New England, such as Maine, and the English speaking people were such that the British, in their wickedness, not wisdom, decided that the final solution was ethnic cleansing. So they basically moved in and moved the French out. The military moved the French out. So the poem tells the story of this. And then there was a diaspora because they were deported forcibly from that area, from the Nova Scotia and the maritime states of what is now Canada and from the northern reaches of what is now New England. The diaspora spread all over, but particularly many of them ended up settling in Louisiana. And the reason for that was there was already a French history and heritage there. Louisiana, of course, named after King Louis. And so that a lot of them ended up staying there. And my favorite, apart from my home state of South Carolina, because it's what has been English patriot, I'm a South Carolinian patriot. My favorite state in the United States is Louisiana. I love the music. I love the food. I love the culture. I love the Catholicism, particularly the area around Lafayette, the heartland of Cajun countries, because the Acadians became sort of Americanized as the Cajuns, and that culture is still very much alive. So we're in Louisiana for the Chestnut Conference. That's the home of the Cajuns, and that's why I think that it was Dale Oldcrest possibly that came up with the idea, or why does Joseph do something on the poem Evangeline, if you prefer, by Longfellow and Christopher Check, and give us the whole historical minutiae of what happened.
He does love to do that. That's very interesting. I must confess, I'm going to come out and say it. I have not read the poem yet, so I am looking forward to that pleasure. And so, for those of us who don't know it very well, you just gave a little history. But what is sort of the subject matter of the poem?
Well, the good news, Grettelyn, is that it's not a mortal sin to not have read the poem.
Oh, thank goodness.
The bad news is, however, it's a literary sin of omission that you should rectify at your earliest opportunity. So the poem itself is an epic. It's written in the epic mode. It tells a narrative story, and it's really in 2 parts. there's a wonderful prologue, and perhaps before we finish, I might be permitted to read the prologue, because it really sets the scene. But the first part of the narrative part of the poem is about the idyllic life in the Shire,
Mm.
because basically Longfellow sets this scene of this beautiful village called Grand Pre, and the people there, fishing village and farming, and it's really idyllic and peaceful, and just it's the perfect agrarian rustic idyll. And of course, it's ruined by empire, by imperialists, the army of Mordor moving in. So the first part is setting this idyllic scene of rustic simplicity and harmony with nature and with neighbour. And then the second part, following the British coming in and forcibly removing them, is the quest of Evangeline to be reunited with her betrothed. So the British move in on the actual day of, they move in on the eve of the wedding,
Mm.
and then on the day of the wedding, just as the families of the village are gathering together to celebrate the wedding of Evangeline and Gabrielle, her fiance, the British move in and forcibly separate the men from the women, and Gabriel is shipped off in a different ship
Mm.
from Evangeline, and the rest of the story is the quest of Evangeline to find her beloved. And there's a wonderful climax to the poem, which I'm not going to give away, because I might even give it away at the talk, because I think that the power of the poem is in that twist at the end. And if we know what it is already, it's like giving away the murderer in an Agatha Christie or Father Brown story. I mean, you've ruined the story. So, but just to say that it's a marvelous, evocative poem of true self-sacrificial love, and so it's very, very, very inspiring.
Mm. Excellent. I always wish you were my professor at some point, because now I really want to read it. So much better than the back of the dust jacket. Thank you. Very good.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things too that we're going to be speaking a lot about on this podcast in coming weeks, and we've already spoken about it a few times in sort of teasing the conference and why I've gotten that question a lot, because I did suggest really choose the location this year of New Orleans, and why. So first of all, in a very selfish way, New Orleans is just my favorite city in the United States, probably to visit. Um, but part of the reason for that is that I don't mean this to sound disparaging or in any way pejorative, but it doesn't necessarily feel like a United States city, a city in America. It feels older than it is. And I think one of the reasons for that is precisely this Cajun influence. And I think that some people, they just take Cajun for granted. Maybe they grew up with, as I did, that show, and I forget the fellow's name on PBS. The Cajun chef, making jambalaya, and it's a bit of a caricature, but the Cajun culture is this deep rooted culture that you don't necessarily get in a lot of colonial cultures, where there's a real tale of sadness and hardship and of displacement to this diaspora that you speak about, Joseph. And I think all of that lends to sort of the richness, the beauty of the culture that you can really feel palpably around you down there, when you're
Yeah,
visiting.
if I could speak to that, obviously I speak as an Englishman who's lived in the United States now for almost a quarter of a century, and one thing I find disheartening about modern American culture is it's the same strip malls all over the country. You can travel all across the country and it looks basically the same, right? This is dumbing down, as Chester must say, standardization by a low standard. But it's not true of Louisiana. I remember for several years we had a Chesterton conference down there in Ponchatoula, which bestows itself as the strawberry capital of the world, which is rather preposterous little tiny place in the middle of nowhere. But it's big for being small. That's the point. I remember being down there and having sort of crawfish boil, and then going to a pot boil on someone's porch where we're drinking good ale while this chap is actually making this huge cauldron of this sort of crawfish boil, Cajun music being played on the fiddle. This is true, authentic culture that's not being completely and utterly smothered by the 21st century. And that's one. That's they did put the food, the music, the Catholic culture. I mean, in Lafayette, the town's still divided into parishes on the European model. So put all of that together, and you can see why Louisiana for me is my favorite state, apart from the one in which I'm living.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Well,
Joe.
maybe if we could explore a little more the poem, its merits, but also Longfellow, because as I mentioned, that was the third question that I bombarded you with, and I think easy to miss. But really, who is this guy? Why does he deserve a reading? Maybe just introduce a little bit of Longfellow and his legacy to the listeners.
Well, I'm glad you brought the question back, because I was just thinking that I hadn't answered it, and if you hadn't brought the question back, I would probably interjected the question myself again, because it's a very important one, the importance of Longfellow. And if I can just go off on a little bit of a tangent here, if you look at intellectual history generally, and literary history perhaps in particular, you find that what happens in history is what I call the game of leapfrog, because we can't create anything new and can't create anything ex nihilo, anything from nothing. That all ideas and all art is building upon the past. So if there's a certain period or epoch in history that people want to rebel against, what tends to happen is they don't create something authentically original. They leapfrog over the epoch they don't like and rediscover and then do things to, normally bad things, to the earlier period. And you have the neo, right? So we can now place Longfellow in that situation, because Romanticism, which really began. Well, we'll talk about let's talk about English Romanticism, because if we start bringing in French, German, Spanish, and Italian Romanticism, the whole topic gets far too big. And of course, Longfellow's a writer in the English language, so that's the tradition to which he belongs. When I say English Romanticism, I mean Romanticism in the English language, not necessarily from that particular country. So English Romanticism was a rebellion against the scientism and philosophical materialism of the 18th century, the so-called Enlightenment or Age of Reason. And it was a reaction against that reason. So whereas you had this sort of irrational rationalism in the name of reason, that's all about the head. So it's sort of forget the heart. It's all about the head. It's the hardening of the head. We then have Romanticism, which you can come to the truth through feeling, through emotion. It's not merely an empirical exercise, and some things that are transcendental, such as goodness, truth, and beauty, can't be quantified. They can't be measured in a test tube, and these things are also true. So one consequence of Romanticism is neo-medievalism. So that neo-medievalism was actually one of the roots of the Catholic cultural revival. So Longfellow's a romantic. He's in that romantic tradition. He is, for me, the greatest poet of the 19th century in America. And I see him as being very similar to Alfred Lord Tennyson in England. They're very similar spirits. So the things they write are very similar. And I love both of them. And both of them have been eclipsed. Now, why have they been eclipsed? Why have they been ignored? Why are they not read now? Because this game of leapfrog. So in the early 20th century, literary modernism rebelled against Romanticism. So whereas the Romantics have sort of rebelled against the sort of poets of the 18th century and the late 17th century. So, for instance, John Dryden and Alexander Pope were sort of eclipsed by Romanticism, have never really made a comeback. And then you get the beginning of the 20th century with this rebellion against Romanticism that Tennyson and Longfellow were eclipsed and abandoned and not read because they were spurned by the modernists. And so consequently, you have these two great poets, one English and the other American, Tennyson and Longfellow, who are giants, who have basically been shackled, a bit like Gulliver's Travels, by Lilliputian pygmies, and have never really managed to be broken free from that. So we do need to rediscover Longfellow, who's an absolute giant of 19th century American literature. And I hope that perhaps if the rediscovery of this poem, which I haven't read everything Tennyson wrote, Longfellow wrote, but this is my favorite. I won't say best. Might be, but subjective judgments are safer. It's my favorite. Nobody can argue with that, right? If I say the best, and we could have people quibbling. But I hope that people, being introduced to this poem might be reintroduced to the brilliance of Longfellow.
Mm. Well, I have heard that his translation of Dante is one of the best ever. So that's exciting because I love Dante. Yeah.
I love Longfellow's translation of Dante. In fact, that's the translation I use in poems every Catholic should know. Although I would have to confess, it's also because it's free.
Doesn't hurt.
It's not in copyright. Dorothy Hill says his translation, for instance, is in copyright. I love hers too. But as poetry, Longfellow's is superior to Dorothy Hill says, in my opinion. But as a translation, you could argue that it isn't. But that's another discussion.
I'm always introducing other discussions. Yeah. Well, wonderful. Yeah. So how do we get Longfellow back into the public eye? What are your suggestions?
Well, we need to champion him. That's the way to do it. Is to, and of course, scheduling talks at conferences on his works is obviously one way of doing that. So I've just written an essay this morning, Haunted by the Ghost of Evangeline. So, we need to just spread the word and get people to return to Longfellow. If they return to Longfellow, they'll love Longfellow because he's a wonderful, if they have any poetic sensibility. On that, might I be allowed to just read at least the first few lines of the prologue to the poem?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
And then maybe I'll say just a few words about it. So this is before the narrative begins. It's scene setting. It's actually set in the future from the perspective of the narrative. In other words, it's set in Grand Pré when all of the population have been removed forcibly, and the farm buildings have fallen down and in ruins, and there's just this ghost village left, right? And it's what nature. This is Longfellow as a romantic. Sort of nature lamenting the loss of this idyllic human community. So this is basically what's being said here. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded with moss and in garments green, indistinct in the twilight, stand like druids of eld, with voices sad and prophetic, stand like harpers hoar, with beards that rest on their bosoms. Loud from its rocky caverns, the deep-voiced neighbouring ocean speaks, and in accents disconsolate answers the wail of the forest. This is the forest primeval. But where are the hearts that beneath it leap like the roe, when he hears in the woodland the voice of the huntsman? Where is the thatch-roofed village, the home of Acadian farmers, men whose lives glided on like rivers that water the woodlands, darkened by shadows of earth, but reflecting an image of heaven? Waste are those pleasant farms, and the farmers forever departed, scattered like dust and leaves, when the mighty blasts of October seize them and whirl them aloft, and sprinkle them far o'er the ocean. Naught but tradition remains of the beautiful village of Grand Pré. Ye who believe in affection that hopes and endures and is patient, ye who believe in the beauty and strength of woman's devotion, list to the mournful tradition still sung by the pines of the forest. List to a tale of love in Acadie, home of the happy.
Puts you right in the scene.
It does. And I often think that or when reading this, it was very successful in its time. You mentioned skipping over. Of course, he later becomes neglected, but for a time, this was very well regarded. And what I haven't researched, and I would be fascinated, I have a hunch that so much of this is kind of prophetic of this turmoil and crisis that the American Republic is about to go through. Just a couple decades after, not even 2 decades after it's written, right? The American Civil War, that, this, I could imagine a lot of mothers whose sons have gone off to war, and brother separated from brother, and things like that, really finding in a work like this some solace and comfort. It's
Yeah, I
beautiful.
talk about in the essay I wrote this morning, also about the civilian victims of political tyranny. And I use the modern phrase ethnic cleansing because that's basically what happened to the Cajuns. Well, the ethnic cleansing hasn't ended
Mm.
with the Cajun diaspora. It continues. So that the whole of history is filled with whole communities being uprooted and moved forcibly or exterminated or a mixture of both because of political upheaval and the rise of political tyrants. So, this is a timeless poem. It's not, on the one hand, it's about something very particular, very small and beautiful, the Cajun community. But on the other hand, like all great things, it's applicable on the minute local level, but also applicable on the universal level.
Yeah, even in a weird way, it reminds me of Chernobyl. I mean, I don't know. I've seen a lot of documentaries about like what's going on there now, and that's what it's like. It's just taken back over by nature. There's animals running through the old houses, and it's just a strange sort of, I don't know, post-human age to just look at those sorts of things, either to from an audio point of view, for like you just read for us, or from a visual point of view. It sort of stirs your heart in a very strange way.
Yeah, and the mess, which is Eastern Europe and Central Europe, is because the borders of these countries have always been changing when one population has been pushed east or pushed west or pushed south or pushed north.
Mm.
The war in the 90s in the Balkans, the various communities there. If you don't have a stability that allows people to stay in the same place for centuries, you have a radical instability which leads to immense suffering, both of civilians and leads to war.
Yeah, and I mean, even in my own area, in a very small way, I'm not saying we're anywhere near that, but like, I live in a farming community, and many of the farmers are trying to sell up, and they're selling to developers. So, right behind my house, we have two houses that popped up in the space of a month. And there's a few hundred more coming, and it's just this weird, wild thing that, a year ago there were deer and foxes and pheasants and many, many bugs, and now there's maybe a few field mice and a lot of construction, and it's just a different kind of destruction. It's interesting. There's sort of this Guardian push against beauty that we can see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say about us, where we live here, we call our home Lady Down on 2.5 acres surrounded by trees. But I say that we moved to the countryside and without moving found ourselves in the suburbs.
Mm. Hmm.
Because the developments are coming up all around us, and thankfully, because we're guarded by trees, we can't see any of them, but we certainly don't have to go very far to find them now. That's for sure.
Yeah. It's just odd. It's just sort of like, and maybe it's like a cycle, because there's the abandonment of human community, and then there's sort of this almost like too fast growth, and neither of them are very good, I think. But anyway, sorry, divergent, but personal
No,
opinion.
that's absolutely. A lot of this is about what this poem is about. Those things that are timeless and changeless, those things that are enduring, the permanent things. Love, true love, sacrifice, a refusal to allow external accidents of history to change the essential aspect of your relationship with your beloved.
Mm.
So there's that tension, of course, between between the permanent and the mutable, the changeable, is part of human life. I mean, we find ourselves getting old, but insofar as we have, well, some of us do,
Well, I'm
find ourselves
there.
getting, we all find ourselves getting older. Some of us find ourselves getting old. But the point is that insofar as we have a grasp of the eternal things, the permanent things, there's something which is essentially unchanging in us, except perhaps a growth in a maturity that allows us to understand the permanent things better. But there's no radical shift, right? There's no radical change. So on the other hand, of course, if we're relativists, we're just trying to be chased by or chasing the latest fad and fashion, sort of a bit like Paolo and Francesco in the Inferno, being blown around by the winds of fashion and finding no rest.
Mm.
As you were speaking there, Joseph, your diction actually reminded me so much of Belloc in The Four Men, that in that beautiful apostrophe opening to the four men when he speaks to Sussex, his beloved county, his beloved home. And it is one of the great tragedies, great regrets that I have, that precisely because, by the time Belloc and Chesterton sort of come around, they're English, they're able to connect with writers like Tennyson, and in spite of, attempts to bury them. But I'm not aware of either of them encountering or dealing with Longfellow. And particularly this poem, I could just imagine Belloc loving this. And what a shame, really, that the separation of the ocean and then the prejudice of contemporaries that kind of put it aside seems to have robbed us of two great commentaries that we might have had. Now I say that, and Dale's probably going to at the conference come up with 100 different references where Chesterton talks about Longfellow, but I'm not aware of it anyway. But that wistful kind of remembrance of tradition, but also the state. I don't think it's insignificant that the name of this poem, the name of the protagonist, translates as the same word as for the gospel, right? Because there is something in this of just, this is the Christian lot, Eden. We've been kicked out of Eden. We're trying to find our way back by way of the beloved, right? So it's
it starts after all the story starts in the forest primeval after the fall.
Yeah.
Right. The forest primeval is not the idyllic place which it was. It's a place which has been ruined by evil, by the forced expulsion, not Adam and Eve, of course, choose their own that destiny through sin, but the Acadians are innocent victims who are forced out of Eden. So it's absolutely, and we need to remember, of course, that that although it was sometime later that Longfellow translates Dante. This is a man who belongs to the old world, not merely the new world. He would certainly have known if he loved Dante enough to translate him. We can be fairly sure that when he wrote this poem, he knew Dante already quite well. The Divine Comedy begins in a dark forest, right? I don't think it's any coincidence that this poem also begins in the dark forest.
Cool.
Yeah, gets you excited to hear this talk. So we'll, I think, wrap it to prevent any spoilers that could come up. But I for one am really looking forward to that whole morning. This will be on Saturday morning when Joseph and Chris regale us with both this fascinating history and then just this lovely work of American literature that has been too long neglected and needs to be brought back.
Yeah, so plan your Friday afterglow accordingly.
That's right. Present company included, right, sure. Joseph?
If I'm speaking on Saturday morning, I must make sure I'm in bed by 3 a.m. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Or at least, if you're young and you have some stamina, you just go to the talk and then go to bed afterward. I don't know, sleep through lunch or something.
Well, I might have stamina, but I don't think I can claim to be young.
I can't do that. I couldn't do that. Wonderful. Well, any final thoughts on the conference or anything else you want to share with us, Joseph, before we have to wrap up here?
Well, only that that the Chesterton Conference has been, since I went to my first one, I think it was in 2002. I've been to most of them. I've only missed a handful since then. That it's one of my favorite events of the year. It probably is my favorite conference of the year. Susanna, my wife, actually wants me to go to it because she knows that I'm going to meet up with old friends and have a good time. So, if I'm complaining about having to travel all the time, that this is one where she sort of thinks it's good for me to go to it. When I come back feeling completely exhausted for 2 days, I'm not so sure. But on the third day, I'll rise again from the dead. So, and it's great. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, if you want to see Joseph and hear this wonderful talk and Chris's awesome talk that I'm sure will be amazing as well, and all of the talks that we have lined up, you can sign up for the conference. We will have that link in our show notes. Do it soon and get your hotel discount and everything. We would really love to see you there. It's going to be amazing. Joe, any last thoughts from you before we head off here?
No, I just hope that this whets the appetites and gets some of those out there watching, listening, as excited as I am to not just to see Joseph again, but to really engage with some great content. So.
Wonderful. And we hope to see you there, and we hope that you will share this podcast with your friends. Definitely subscribe, hit the like button, make sure that you get every episode that we put out. We are so thankful for you, our listeners, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Thank you, and God bless.